Oh boy. So, some of you may have noticed I haven't covered a lot of RPGs or long-playing strategy games on the show so far. Now, part of the reason for that is simple. Ancient DOS Games is essentially produced at a weekly pace, so when the game I'm covering, in this case Heroes of Might and Magic 2, literally has over 200 hours of gameplay, that's presuming you know what you're doing, yeah, there's no way in hell I can even show a fraction of the content for this game. So, after some practice, I decided to instead commit myself to a single map, just so I could get a taste of as much as I could, and from what little I played, I can tell you right now, this thing is extremely well put together, with only minor quirks here and there. Curiously, it's not as deep on strategy as I expected it to be, and discovered the more I played that the strategy is more in the metagame, such as deciding which kinds of units work best against which kind of units, when to spend your money and when not to, where to put your units between turns to get the most useful amount of movement on your next turn. The actual combat, even though there's plenty of it and it plays on a hex grid, is incredibly simple and straightforward, with less strategy involved than you'd expect. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, you can sort of think of this game as a simpler version of Master of Magic, as it has many of the same elements, but all of those elements don't have the same level of depth to deal with. In fact, I'm pretty sure this series as a whole was inspired by Master of Magic, seeing as that Might and Magic is a dungeon crawling series which started way back in the 80s, while Heroes of Might and Magic got its start the year following Master of Magic. Heroes of Might and Magic 2 was developed by a company called New World Computing, and was published through the 3DO company in 1996. It's a 1-to-6 player turn-based strategy game supporting SVGA 640x480 256 color graphics, and once again, an insane number of audio devices, at least as far as the 1997 Gold release is concerned, although most of these devices existed back in 96 as well. Now, typically speaking, when the list of supported devices is this long and includes things that don't make sense, like Tandy 3 voice support, usually it's because the game's using a third-party sound library, as this was the case for a lot of mid to late 90s DOS software. As for its current release date, it's still commercial and is yet another game available from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com as the Gold version, which includes the expansion pack for the game, for $10. I should also note that the first 5 games in the series are available from GOG, so if this one alone isn't enough gameplay, somehow, there's even more to acquire. As for physical copies, they're hard to find and not cheap when you do find them. Loose copies are tending to go for between $10 to $20 when I looked, and I have no idea how much a fully boxed copy is worth because I couldn't find one. Now, there do exist collection packs as well, which include the second game in the series, and they're on similar prices, so that's another option as well if you prefer a physical copy. Before you begin playing the game solo, you get to choose if you want to play in Standard Mode or the Campaign Mode. The Campaign Mode offers a set of scenarios to play through, along with a basic story to tie it all together. But because of just how massive the content of this game is, I decided to go for just Standard Mode. I mean, geez, just look at the number of maps available to play. And would you believe the game comes with an editor so you could make even more of them? Now, because of the fixed nature of the maps, each one will have a set number of players or AI opponents, as well as specific win and lose conditions. Now, if you reach one of the win conditions at any point in time, you win the map. If you reach one of the lose conditions, you lose. Pretty straightforward. Although, I wish the game would actually show tooltips for the win and lose condition icons. Like, they're listed in the manual, and most everything else in the game has tooltips, so this is just one of those minor quirks I mentioned the game has. You can also choose which color you'll be, which in turn affects where you'll start on the map. Now, a couple points of note when starting a new game is that, firstly, you get to choose the class of your first hero, which in turn affects what kind of town you start with, as the way it works in this game is that all unit types conform to a type of town, which in turn is preferred by certain kinds of heroes. These archetypes boil down to barbarians, whom prefer untamed lands filled with orcs, ogres, and other monsters, knights, who set up farmlands and simple plains with archers, cavalry, and other classes of humans, necromancers, who hang out in graveyards and resurrect skeletons and vampires to do their bidding, sorceresses, who live in natural splendor surrounded by magical creatures like sprites and unicorns, warlocks, who command nature to their twisted will, bringing about beings like centaurs and hydras, and finally, wizards, whom construct structures in the clouds and command a mix of magic users and magical constructs, such as golems. You can even select what kinds of heroes your opponents start with, or just leave them set to random. The other interesting thing is that not only do the maps have relative difficulty levels indicating how hard the map is in its design, but you can also choose a difficulty modifier, which affects how good your units are compared to your opponents. At the easiest setting, the enemies are 30% weaker, while at the hardest setting they're 60% stronger. No matter which skill setting you choose, the AI behaves the same, making decisions based on perceived threat. Though naturally, at higher difficulty settings, they'll perceive the threat from you as less and will be more open to outright attacking you. Whereas they'll retreat and fall back or just ignore you completely if they don't feel they can reliably win combat against you. When you actually begin playing, you'll have the hero you selected and a town to start with, often in a castle state since you can't upgrade the rest of your town without a castle being built first. Not to mention each castle you have provides an amount of gold per turn of gameplay, measured in days, with 7 days in a week and 4 weeks in a month. These measurements of time are important as many in-game events are timed as once a day, once a week, or once a month. The other resources to pay attention to are ore, wood, crystals, sulfur, gems, and mercury, which don't increase naturally unless you've taken command of a resource-generating location, such as a mine or a lumber mill. Now on every turn, all heroes and towns get to perform actions. Heroes will have a certain number of movement points available, and will be able to move around and interact with locations on the map until they run out of movement points. The number of movement points available is based on the hero's skills, as well as how fast the units in their party move. Thus, if you want to keep a hero more mobile in order to do more scouting, you'll want to keep slower units out of the party. In terms of forming parties, your towns ultimately get up to 6 different kinds of dwellings which can generate units based on the type of town it is. And many of these dwellings can be upgraded to get an upgraded form of a particular unit. Plus, once upgraded, you can pay to have existing units in town upgraded as well. The tricky part though, and one of the reasons why the game is incredibly well balanced, is that you can only purchase a limited number of each type of unit every week. Now, thankfully, if you have any of a particular unit left over at the end of a week, they carry into the next week, so you don't have to worry about that. But getting all the unit generating dwellings for a town as soon as possible, even if not upgraded, is essential to maximizing the total number of units you can acquire. Purchasing new dwellings or upgrading existing dwellings is something you can do as the town's action for a turn. Now, you're only able to build one dwelling in each of your towns during any turn, and you can also recruit a new hero, provided you don't already have one sitting around in town. The interesting thing about recruiting heroes is that they don't actively engage in combat, save for casting spells. What they do is provide passive bonuses to the units in their parties through their own skills, as well as through any artifacts that they've come in possession of. Depending on how combat is lost will depend on what happens to the hero, as well as the units under their command. So, compared to Master of Magic, there's a lot less micromanagement going on here. A case in point is the spell system. In this game, spells are acquired for free from mages guilds, or are acquired from places on the map, with each hero having various skills at casting spells, and a quantity of spell points at their disposal. There's actually a ton of spells in this game, but I didn't get a chance to use many of them as I was focusing on other things. Again though, the whole process of using spells and acquiring them is far simpler here. One thing that's interesting about the game, which caught me slightly by surprise, is that neutral units don't move, ever. It actually took a little to get used to this, because often the maps are constructed to make it difficult to get the various treasures without first finding a way to circumvent or defeat units defending those treasures. Fortunately though, the game also remembers the state you leave those neutral units in. So if you fight some, lose, but kill a few all the same, the ones you killed will still be dead by the time you return. Getting used to the wording for quantities is important too, so you can gauge how difficult the various encounters are going to be, not to mention recognizing the types of enemies you'll face, in which case having the manual handy can be greatly beneficial. The wording for the quantities, though, isn't actually specified in the manual, but the game refers to less than 5 as a few, less than 10 as several, less than 20 as a pack, less than 50 as lots, less than 100 as a horde, and less than 250 as a throng. There's also bigger words than that, but by then the numbers are so ridiculous, you'd better go in with your own ridiculous numbers. So let's talk about combat. As already stated, combat takes place on a hexagonal grid, with the attacker on the left and the defender on the right. To initiate combat, simply move to any spot where your cursor changes into a sword symbol, as this means you'll be in range to begin combat. Whoever initiated the combat will get the advantage, although the turn order for the units is random to some degree based on unit speed. Now, each hero or town is able to have up to 5 groups of units, with each group having any number of just one kind of unit present. On a group's turn, they may either skip their turn, move, attack, or move and attack, provided they're using a melee attack and not a ranged attack. Now, this took a little to get used to, but the way you attack in melee is not by clicking on what you want to attack. Rather, instead, you click on the dividing line, which represents the spot you wish to attack an enemy from, at which point your group will move into position and strike. For ranged attacks, you click on the group you wish to attack, although ranged units can only perform ranged attacks when no melee fighters are next to them. For movement, you generally just click on the grid spot you want to move to. But for entities which take up 2 spaces, you click on the leftmost space you want them to occupy. Your hero is also able to cast a spell on any of your unit's turns, provided they have spells to cast and spell points to cast those spells with. When an attack lands, several things occur. Firstly, each unit in an attack group will deal a particular amount of damage to the defending group, with those damage amounts reduced based on the defense rating of the target group. However, the way hit points are handled is that only one unit in the group can be injured at a time. When damage is dealt, if a unit in the group is defeated, the damage continues getting dealt to the next unit in line, then to the next, and the next, for however long it takes to exhaust the total amount of damage dealt. For instance, if your enemy has a group of 10 units, each with 3 hit points, and you deal 10 hit points of damage, you'll kill 3 units in the group and leave the current unit with only 2 hit points left. Now, any group which hasn't already sustained a melee attack since its last turn is also able to perform a retaliatory strike against any group which attacks it. This actually adds an important element into whether you want to go offensive or defensive, or where you even want to move to. Generally speaking, you want to have the first strikes as often as you can against enemy groups, and you want to try to focus on single groups at a time so as to avoid as many retaliation strikes as possible. Lessons I didn't learn until after I was done recording footage. Go figure. Now, that said, the game offers an auto feature to automatically have your units fight with the same level of AI as the computer players. So if you have no skill with this at all, then you can just leave it entirely up to the computer, and thus entirely dependent on how good your unit combinations are. But the AI isn't perfect. One of its weaknesses is that it focuses on ranged units first whenever possible, even when it doesn't make good sense to do so. Which is actually very little of the time, as ranged units are exceedingly good to have, but they tend to get killed easy, thus why the AI focuses on them so heavily. It's also important to take advantage of positioning, something the AI isn't good at. For example, ranged units can't attack if they have enemies next to them, so if you do it right, you can position your fast-moving melee combatants to be focused on 2 ranged units at a time which are near each other, thus preventing them from being a threat, or you can even position near a group of ranged units but attack a nearby group of melee units instead. When attacking towns in particular, if the town has a castle with various fortifications, a siege will take place. Siege combat is similar to normal combat, except you'll have a catapult attempting to smash down walls, and the various castle defenses will hinder your progress, as there's a wall which will need to crumble before your non-flying units can bypass it. And if there's a moat, you can't enter and exit the moat on the same turn. You have to enter it on one turn and exit it on the next. The combat ends in one of 3 ways, either with someone's defeat, retreat, or surrender. Again, heroes can't be killed, but if their party is wiped, they'll be stripped of their goods and left in shame, at which point they'll abandon your cause and potentially show up as a first level hero for a different player. If a hero retreats, all units in the party are lost, but the hero stays alive and retains all of their stuff, thus they can be recruited again for a fee if you want them back. Surrendering is only an option against enemy heroes. Doing so requires paying a substantial fee in gold, but will allow the hero to leave peacefully with their party intact. However, the hero still needs to be recruited again in order to be back in your ranks. Surprisingly, for the amount of content this game has, I don't actually have too much more to say about it, as the bulk of the game is content, not depth or complexity, though there are a couple general points of interest. For one thing, many of the music tracks have vocals, generally opera-style singing, but you can actually disable these vocals if you want to, which is an option I don't think I've ever seen in a game up to now. Another curious thing is that there's no upkeep costs in this game. Sure, you have a bunch of different resources and hordes of gold, but you don't lose them every turn for any reasons whatsoever. Again, many aspects of the game are simplified compared to other similar games, and not having upkeep is weird, but it's not unwelcome. Overall, given the nature of how simple Heroes of Might and Magic 2 is, this is a game I actually didn't mind playing, even if I did have it set to easy skill. Normally I'm pretty terrible at strategy games, but this one doesn't have nearly as many variables to keep track of compared to other similar games, and that's why I was able to keep up with it as well as I could. The lack of complexities may be a turnoff for some players though, so I would tend to recommend this one for people who prefer simpler strategy games over deeper complex ones, or for anyone who just likes strategy games in general. Even if you're not a fan of the genre, it may still be worth checking out if the only thing keeping you from enjoying them is the difficulty or complexity. Besides, it comes with a map editor, so you can always just make maps tailored specifically to your own level of skill if you're so inclined. Yep, there's no extra configuration for DOSBox necessary this time around. Just leave cycle set to auto and the game will run perfectly fine. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday is episode 215, and we'll be taking a look at a game that's all about setting traps. Yeah, there's not a lot of games like that, even when you count modern stuff, so if you think you know of one such game made for DOS, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned to see how well or not well this idea worked out. Thanks for watching everyone, and special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's a small random set of you guys.